I was 5 years old when my parents left me alone at the airport, a tiny red scarf dragging across the cold linoleum, their footsteps fading like a lie I was forced to believe. 30 years later, they walked into a courtroom smirking, convinced they could take everything from me. They didn't know the child they abandoned had grown into someone who understood silence, power, and patience. As the bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise for the judge," the room shifted, and I realized this was never just about money. It was about a secret they could never see coming. What they didn't know next would change everything. I remember that airport like it was yesterday, though it's been 30 years. Terminal 3 at O'Hare hummed with announcements and rolling suitcases, but I felt like I was underwater, disconnected from the rush around me. I was 5, bundled in a red scarf that scratched at my neck, my small fingers clutching it like a lifeline. Richard and Elaine Hart walked ahead, checking watches, moving with sharp, synchronized steps, not noticing or not caring that I existed. Their eyes never met mine. When they pointed toward the oversized baggage area, their voices were clipped. "Wait here," they said. Relief, not panic in their expression. I sat down counting bags. 1, 10, 50, 100. The carousel moved endlessly and the crowd thinned. By the time I reached 500, I realized something no child should know. I wasn't forgotten. I was left behind on purpose. The silence of the empty terminal pressed on me heavy and suffocating. It taught me that absence can cut sharper than words, and that the world wouldn't always notice when you were gone. Then he appeared, a man in a gray suit, ordinary in every way, yet deliberate. He knelt in front of me without touching me, just looking, acknowledging that I existed. "I'm Thomas," he said quietly. The security guard had started to radio for help, but Thomas shook his head, firm but soft. In that instant, someone chose me when my own blood did not. He stayed until the authorities arrived, then through foster care placements, and eventually stayed for good. Thomas never wanted recognition. He lived simply quietly supporting the people he could. I only learned after his death that he had secretly built a fortune, invested, grown quietly, and left everything to me. $5.5 million. It wasn't the kind of money that changes a childhood, but it was the kind of money that forces the world to see me now. And the first call that came wasn't from gratitude or family, it was a process server. Richard and Elaine Hart were back, and this time they weren't asking how I was. They were suing me. I read their complaint slowly, disbelief curling around me. They claimed I had been lost, that their hearts had been broken for decades, that they were victims of circumstance. Every word was a performance, every sentence designed to make me doubt myself. But I knew the truth. I wasn't a victim. They were greedy, calculating, and they thought they could buy me again. Sitting there in my apartment, the red scarf folded in my lap, I realized silence could be a weapon. They had started a fight, but I had 30 years of patience, of study, of control. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't beg. I would make them pay, not with violence, but with the law itself. The first night I sat with the lawsuit in my hands, I didn't move. The envelope felt heavier than any baggage I'd ever carried. Richard and Elaine Hart wanted every cent Thomas had left me. $5.5 million. They didn't call. They didn't write. They filed a claim, and in their minds, the money was theirs by right. I stared at their names on the papers, and for the first time in decades, the anger inside me stirred slow and deep like lava beneath ice. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't a child anymore. I was Melody, a judge in my own right, and I knew instinctively that reactionary emotion would be a weakness. Instead, I called someone who could see what I couldn't, the forensic accountant Sarah Jenkins. She had the reputation of uncovering truths hidden in mountains of old numbers. I handed her the lawsuit and a single instruction: go back to the beginning. Payments, bills, property records. Every thread from 1994 onward. As Sarah worked, I couldn't stop thinking about that terminal. That day, I learned my parents were capable of choosing anything over me. The red scarf, the cold metal bench, the hum of the conveyor belt, they were still there, stitched into my memory. The more I thought, the angrier I became, not at the money, but at the sheer audacity, the calculated cruelty. They had treated me like property, liquidated their loss, and decades later had the nerve to walk back into my life as if nothing had happened. Then Sarah called. It was late, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the heater. "Look at 1995, she said flatly. I leaned over her shoulder as she pulled up an archived civil suit. My parents had sued the airline, claiming I'd been lost during an unaccompanied minor flight to a sick relative. The airline had settled, paying them a fortune at the time. But the settlement wasn't just about money, the affidavit. I read it carefully. They had legally declared me dead. Their own signatures confirmed it. I felt a strange combination of cold clarity and simmering rage. Every smirk, every calculated gesture from the present lawsuit now had a weight I could measure. The child they abandoned had been sold once, and they thought they could do it again. But this time I wasn't powerless. I had 30 years of knowledge, authority, and patience. They had reopened the door. I was ready to step through. The turning point wasn't immediate. It was the realization that the past was not buried. The lies, the greed, the deception they had left trails, breadcrumbs for anyone patient enough to follow. And I was patient. 30 years of silence had been training. 30 years of waiting had prepared me for this moment. They had underestimated me, as they always had. By the end of the night, I had a plan forming in my mind. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to let the law do what my words and tears never could. I would take every piece of evidence, every signature, every payment, and build a case that their performance could not survive. They thought they were suing a victim. They didn't realize they were stepping into a war they couldn't control. For the first time in decades, I felt the quiet burn of focus sharpen into purpose. Sitting at my dining table, surrounded by stacks of bills payments and old property records, I realized how much of my life had been stolen, not in dollars, but in time, in trust, in innocence. The apartment smelled faintly of old coffee and paper, a contrast to the sterile precision of the courthouse I now inhabited daily. Every document I touched reminded me of their calculated greed, each folded corner and faded ink a testament to how methodically they had erased me from their lives. I called Sarah again, outlining the full scope of what I needed. "Trace everything back to 1994, I said, my voice steady, controlled. "I want to know where every dollar came from, where every settlement ended up." Her agreement was simple, professional, no encouragement, no judgment, just numbers and facts. That's exactly what I wanted. This wasn't about rage. This was about building a case they could not deny. As she dug, I revisited the old airport in my mind. The hum of the conveyor belt, the way the lights had dimmed when the crowd left the cold metal bench where I had sat counting 500 pieces of luggage. That silence had crushed me once, but now I could feel it differently. It was my blueprint, my teacher. It had taught me patience, observation, the art of measuring moments before acting. I traced each memory like a map, remembering every detail that could turn the tide in my favor. Then I uncovered the first thread. Payments from the 1995 settlement signed affidavits and receipts, evidence that my parents had been actively profiting off my absence. They had gambled while the world thought they were grieving. Each piece of evidence tightened the coil in my chest, but I didn't let it explode. Rage without control would only weaken me. I had to remain composed, as I had learned from years on the bench. Every sigh, every measured breath, every subtle movement mattered. By the third day, I had the skeleton of the case. The victims of their own making were about to be confronted by the truth they had carefully hidden. I looked at the red scarf folded on my desk, a small frayed piece of fabric from the day they had abandoned me. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was a reminder of what I had survived and what I would now wield as armor. I placed the documents in neat stacks, ready to transform every act of betrayal into undeniable evidence. When my parents returned expecting the same frightened child, they would instead face the woman who had spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment. Their smirks would meet the cold calculation of justice. They had opened the door. They were about to walk straight into a trap they could not escape. I didn't sleep that night, but it didn't matter. Every hour spent reviewing payments, bills, and affidavits was a promise the day they stepped into that courtroom I would be ready. And when that day came, I would no longer be the child they abandoned. I would be the judge. The morning they returned to Chicago, I sat quietly at the courthouse, the courtroom empty, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. My parents, Richard and Elaine, walked in late, confident, smirking like predators stepping into a room they thought they owned. Their attorney followed, papers neatly stacked, a smug grin on his face, as if the fight had already been won. They didn't look up at me. They didn't even know I would be presiding today. I waited for the bailiff's announcement, my hands folded over the red scarf I carried as a talisman, a symbol of every lesson learned and every moment survived. The room went silent, a tension that tasted like cold metal and polished wood. Their smirks grew wider when the clerk called their case, first assuming I would recuse myself or be intimidated. They had no idea the trap was already set. The first witness for their side stepped forward, reciting rehearsed lines about a lost daughter, the grief of 30 years, the agony of helpless parents. Their voices were smooth, melodic, persuasive to anyone who hadn't lived the truth. I listened, expression blank, letting each lie hang in the air like smoke. My pulse was steady, heart calm. Rage had no place here, only strategy and patience mattered. Then came the moment that changed the entire courtroom. I called Lily Hart to the stand. She stepped up, shoulders slightly hunched, carrying herself like someone who had spent a lifetime apologizing for being alive. But when she spoke, her voice held quiet authority. She described the years living in a home haunted by a story that wasn't hers, growing up as the replacement child, a living testament to the parents' manipulation. I watched Richard shift in his seat, a subtle tremor in his hands as Lily laid out the truth. Elaine's mouth opened, then closed again, as if trying to swallow the narrative that shattered the one they had built for decades. Lily's voice, calm but piercing, cut through the court. Like a blade, she described receipts, trips, and gambling records, all coinciding with the dates when they claimed to be searching for me. The reality was unavoidable. They had celebrated, they had profited, they had lied. I let silence fill the courtroom after each revelation, letting every word sink in. Silence was my ally, a weapon refined over 30 years. Each pause allowed the gravity of their betrayal to press against them. Their attorney shuffled papers nervously. The parents' smirks faltered, replaced by flickers of panic. The narrative they had constructed for so long was crumbling brick by brick. Then I leaned forward slightly, placing my hands on the bench, the red scarf folded beneath them. The certified affidavit from 1995 was on top, clear and undeniable. They had signed it themselves, legally declaring me deceased in exchange for a settlement. Their own signatures were the chains that bound them. I let the words hang in the air, a punchline no one could argue with. The bailiff's voice rang out sharp and commanding, "All rise for the judge." The courtroom shifted as every eye fixed on me. For a moment, their world tilted. The smug predators they thought they were suddenly felt small, trapped, and exposed. I rose slowly, walking past the defense table, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step measured, deliberate. They looked up, then finally realizing who I had become, not the frightened child, but the authority they had underestimated. I addressed them directly, voice calm, cutting, unyielding. "You sold me," I said. "You abandoned me, cashed in on my absence, and thought you could do it again. But today, this court will decide the consequences of your choices." Each word landed with precision. They opened their mouths to protest, to weep, to plead, but the law was immovable and the weight of 30 years of preparation bore down. I instructed the bailiff to present all evidence, payments, bills, affidavits, and receipts spanning 3 decades. Lily's testimony reinforced the narrative, each detail a nail in the coffin of their story. I watched Richard shrink in his chair, Elaine tremble, their confidence replaced with the unmistakable panic of those who have been cornered. Their attorney tried to intervene, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The court clerk began reading the key affidavit aloud, each sentence a hammer striking their constructed illusion. They had legally acknowledged my death. Now they were legally powerless to challenge the inheritance or the lawsuit they had instigated. They had thought they were suing a victim, but they were facing a judge who had mastered patience control and strategy. Every lie, every smug glance, every calculated smile was undone by 30 years of truth meticulously gathered and legally presented. I allowed a brief pause, letting them feel the full weight of exposure before closing the session with a single declaration: case dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiffs will be referred to the district attorney's office for investigation of perjury and fraud. The gavel fell like a final exhale. Richard and Elaine gasped, their world unraveling in real time. Officers moved in, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice, not in vengeance but in truth, inevitability, and the careful orchestration of consequences. I turned my back on them, walking out of the courtroom with Lily beside me. For decades, they had been the predators, and I had been the hunted child. Today, the tables had turned. And though the courtroom emptied around us, the echoes of that justice would linger far longer than their lies ever could. After the courtroom emptied, I sat in the quiet for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle. Richard and Elaine Hart were no longer figures of power. Their reputation shattered, their wealth and influence slipping through fingers that had once held me like an object. The media would cover it for a day, but the truth, my truth, was permanent. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. Justice wasn't about satisfaction. It was about balance restored. I looked at Lily, who had been standing quietly beside me throughout the ordeal. Her shoulders, once heavy with guilt and fear, now seemed lighter. For the first time, she didn't have to perform grief or uphold a story that wasn't hers. We shared a quiet glance, acknowledging that while the past could not be erased, it no longer dictated our lives. The money Thomas had left me, $5.5 million, was never about indulgence. I used it to establish the Baggage Claim Foundation, a place to support foster children aging out of the system, ensuring that no child would ever feel abandoned, invisible, or worthless. Every dollar was a promise that someone would stand for them when the world didn't. Months later, we met in a Chicago cafe, warm coffee in hand, the red scarf around my neck, a quiet symbol of resilience. Lily laughed at something I said, the weight finally gone from her voice. I realized then that survival wasn't enough. We could rebuild brick by brick, guided by care, truth, and justice. The past had shaped us, but it no longer owned us. I sipped my coffee, the red scarf around my neck, more a symbol of strength than protection. Lily sat across from me, smiling freely for the first time in years. The city buzzed outside, but inside there was quiet, the kind that comes after storms. I had reclaimed my life, and in doing so, I could help others reclaim theirs. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe, because no one should ever face betrayal alone.